I'm Farah Nabulsi. I'm the writer, director, and one of the producers on the feature film The Teacher, a story set in Palestine, shot in Palestine, about the love of a parent, about self-forgiveness, and about the pursuit of justice. Yes, so I wrote the film, directed, and I'm one of the producers on the film. Somebody who's only interested in really making films that matter to me in a deep and meaningful way, that I'm connected to personally. I'm born, raised, educated in the UK, but my blood is Palestinian. I'm 100% Arab and Palestinian. You know, it was during my travels to militarily occupied and colonized Palestine, where I saw with my own eyes the extent of the injustice taking place there, and many of the things that take place in the film, such as children in military detention, such as these illegal Israeli settler vandalism and violence, such as the home demolitions and so on. I spoke with many people who have experienced these things personally, dozens of people. I've even experienced some of the elements, like, you know, at checkpoints and so forth. And so I wrote this story very much because it resonates with me on a personal level. It speaks to my identity, not just as a Palestinian, not just as a filmmaker, but as a human being. I'd like, and I'm happy to lend my artistic expression about something that matters to me to a people who have been severely marginalized and whose voices have been silenced or ignored, and until recently, in many ways, had been forgotten. That's from where it was born, is this sort of amalgamation of all these different stories that I've come across and experiences and conversations, coupled with my own personal, vivid, visual, verbal imagination as a filmmaker. So one of the stories I came across during my travels to Palestine was the story of an Israeli occupation soldier called Gilad Shalit. And he was abducted in 2006 by Palestinian fighters, and he was released for over 1,000 Palestinian political prisoners 5 years later, in 2011, hundreds of whom were women and children. I remember at the time thinking, you know, what an imbalance in value for human life. But I also remember thinking, on the individual level, as a parent myself as well, to that soldier's loved ones, to his parents, on the individual level, he's worth millions. I mean, you know, you ask any parent, what is your child worth to you? They can't express. And so this dynamic that the love of a parent for their child is universal. Loss and pain is universal. And that was a dynamic that also interested me as well. So when I'm writing this story about Bassem al-Saleh, who is the main, you know, protagonist of the story, and the father-son relationship between him and Adam is the main element. The concept, the father and son, you know, love of a parent is Bassem, Adam, Simon, Nathaniel. And I didn't want to dismiss that universality. We are talking about two people in some ways where they have their parallels in love and loss. And that dynamic interests me to examine, you know, the human dynamics of that. But interestingly enough, and that's also interested me, is that they are also opposite and divergent. Because in the case of Simon, he has a recourse for justice. He eventually gets his son. He has a power, a government behind him. Whereas sadly for most Palestinians, no matter how big the crime or how colossal the loss, they do not have a recourse for justice. And in some ways you could say, when the courts and the people that you have to go to for justice are one and the same as those who are complicit in the crime itself, the system is rigged. And that was also very interesting to me, to have that parallel, but also to have that opposite, divergent aspect as well. So it was all interesting to me, and I didn't want to exclude one just because it, you know, it dealt with what, you know, you say the other. So far, I would say no, but you have to remember that this film had its world premiere at Toronto International Film Festival at the beginning of September. And then 1 month later, there was October 7th, and the last 60 days of what can only be described as a genocide in Palestine. And in some ways, you almost feel like my film is a prophecy, but it isn't, because we know that the violence that Palestinians have experiencing, you know, didn't start on October 7th. It's been ongoing for decades, for years, for generations. And all the violence that comes with military occupation, with apartheid, with colonization, that exists. And I wrote this a number of years prior to what's been happening in the last couple of months. It's still early days for my film, and I'm not sure people want to interpret of it or how they're going to maybe point fingers or twist. So, yeah, making independent cinema is extremely hard regardless of where you are in the world. And you can always choose the path of least resistance, not to shoot in what is militarily occupied and a colonized land. But it was really important for me to shoot in Palestine, and we did. And there were practical, pragmatic things that went wrong. For example, while we were in our prep period, all of our team were supposed to take a 2-day weekend, but they ended up being able only to come back 4 days later because the Israeli military had set up roadblocks. That's very frustrating. It's time, it's money, and very painful in independent cinema. But those things going wrong were not what affected me personally the most. For me, it was the emotional, mental toll it took, where you're shooting, you're making a story that is set in a very harsh reality, and you're filming in that harsh reality with that reality unfolding in real time around you. So for example, while we were shooting very near the village of Bareen, in the village of Bareen, which is where our protagonist, Bassem al-Saleh, is from, and he says he's from the village of Bareen. In the actual village of Bareen, near Nablus, illegal Israeli settlers had started torching the olive groves there. Now that is something that takes place in our film as well. And so that was happening in real time. Another example is on my way to work one day. I passed by a family, a couple with their 6 young children standing on the side of the road in front of the rubble of their freshly demolished home. And I ended up getting out the car and speaking with them, and then hugging the mother for about 3 minutes, and we both just cried in each other's arms. And again, a home demolition. It's something depicted in the film. So it was a very, very difficult process where you're trying to remain positive, you're trying to get to the finish line, you're trying to do justice in your film, in your story, to what's actually unfolding in real time. And at one point they started dropping bombs in Gaza towards the end of the shoot. That got people very nervous. Some of our international team were thinking about leaving because, again, while we're shooting in the West Bank, it heightens the tension. Also need to make sure everybody is feeling safe. But I'm so glad we shot there. I'm so glad we shot there. Oh wow, what advice. There's lots of advice. So let's pick a couple of things. Well, first of all, I truly believe in telling the story you want to tell. I personally am very particular about really working hard not to allow the integrity of the story I want to tell to be diluted. Now that doesn't mean not taking advice, and that does not mean having input, and I know it's easy